Good morning. Welcome to the Eastman Financial Report. I'm Dan Eastman, your host, and today is Thursday, February 19th, 2026. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, we appreciate your viewership here at the Eastman Financial Report, as well as throughout the day on all of the amazing programming you see at Worldview Tube and, of course, here at Worldview Radio. As you know, we are a Christian broadcasting network, and it is our mission, our ministry, our passion, and our goal to bring to the great marketplace of ideas all of the news and information of the day, but from a Christian perspective. And that's what we do, and that's what we have been doing since 2006 when we started this broadcast ministry. If you'd like to help us in that effort, you can do that by going to worldviewfoundation.com and, of course, making a donation. The address is on the bottom of the screen. You can go to wvwfoundation.com or worldviewfoundation.com, or you can use the handy QR code, takes your smartphone right to the website, and you can make a one-time donation, which is very appreciated. And you can sign up for monthly donations as well. And that has the added economic benefit of flattening our revenue curve so we can better match costs to revenues, keep our bottom line positive, and then we can continue to broadcast our information free of charge. As you know, you're watching me right now. There's no subscription. There's no paywall. What you're seeing is broadcast media the same way it's been delivered for 2,000 years. If you think of the apostles back in the Middle East wandering about 2,000 years ago, they were offering the good news of the gospel without charging an admission fee. That wasn't an entertainment venue. That was a very serious giving of a precious gift. And we continue that tradition today. For 2,000 years later, here we are still broadcasting the same message from the same perspective. And as that great marketplace of ideas is ever expanding, and through technology and digital and data centers and all the exciting technologies we have today, that marketplace gets bigger and bigger. There's much more choice in the marketplace as to viewpoint. You can hear just about every viewpoint today, and we want to make sure we're front and center with our Christian viewpoint so that we continue this ministry until the second coming. It's very important. So you can help us in that ministry by making a donation, wvwfoundation.com or worldviewfoundation.com, or the QR code takes you right there. You can also help this ministry by doing business with the vendors you see advertising throughout the day on our network. As you know, we're not a commercial broadcast system like selling blocks of advertising time. Rather, we partner with companies we know and trust, and when you do business with them, a small portion of the proceeds comes back to us in the form of a commission, and that also helps us continue in this ministry and keeping our bottom line positive. There's a third way you can help, and this is very important. It's a new product we've come up with. It's called worldviewtube.com/vault. As you know, Brandon House started this ministry in 2006, and he's written 15 books, and he's had conferences, seminars, and events all over. All of that information has been digitized, and it's now stored in our vault, which is a beautiful collection of very spiritual Christian material. So if you are like me and most people, and there are days when you need a little spiritual boost, of course, first and foremost, we turn to scriptures because that is how God speaks to us through word and sacrament. But when you'd like to be part of a Christian community and you have the time, you can log in on demand. You're getting inside the vault, and there's an amazing Christian community in there and some wonderful content, which will help boost your spiritual life and can make a difference in your life. So it's well worth the subscription. Now, there's a paywall. Obviously, this is a subscription, and those proceeds come back to the network. But what a wonderful tool to have in your toolbox so that on those days when you feel like you need a little uplifting, you can go in on demand and you see some really great Christian material. And also keep in mind and remember this, that we all know people in our lives who are struggling for whatever issue. Maybe have personal issues, financial issues, family issues, whatever. What a wonderful gift to give someone a subscription to the vault. You say, well, how can I help my friend or my relative? How can I help this person who I care about? And it's oftentimes difficult. You can meet for coffee or lunch and listen and talk. But what about a subscription that they can go in when they're feeling blue and type in, and there they are in the middle of a wonderful Christian community? It's very uplifting, and it could be very helpful to not only yourself, but your friends. So that's another way you can help. So do business with the vendors and make a donation, and then, of course, subscribe to the vault. I'll also point out that the vault contains the reruns to the Eastman Financial Report. So if you listen to me and you sometimes disagree with what I say, and, of course, this is the dismal science, it's a social science, economics, economics, and there's all sorts of room for disagreement. Well, you can go in, pay the fee, go in, and if you'd like to come on the show and debate economic theories and principles and observations, we'd love to have you. But that's another way you can help out. Well, let's talk about the news today. And of course, yesterday, if you watched my program, I tried to cram into a half hour a very complex discussion about this phenomenon we're seeing nationwide of data centers. And they're exploding across the country, and they're gigantic projects, and they cost billions of dollars. And of course, society, the people in the community are reacting to these because, first of all, they're very large in scale, they're very visible, and there's lots of political shenanigans behind the curtain to get these things permitted and approved and zoned, and off they go. It's become quite the controversial topic, but it's a very interesting discussion to have because throughout modern times, we've had evolution in our technology. I don't like to use the word evolution, especially on a Christian broadcasting network. But the point is, technology has advanced over time. And I think is it Moore's law that says every 2 years computers get to be twice as fast and more powerful. So we all know, if you've been around any length of time at all, that we have basements and attics full of technology that was very expensive when we bought it, and yet today is obsolete. It just takes up space on a shelf, and you think, well, I should maybe recycle it, but I have to pay money to get rid of it, so it just sits on the shelf. The point is the technology changes rather rapidly, and it's not going to slow down anytime soon, especially with AI and all of the modern data crunching technologies that we look at. So all of this leads to some really big questions as to what are we doing and with building these plants. And I was digress a little bit. I had a very sad opportunity a few years ago to fly to San Jose, California, for a funeral of a very dear friend. And while we were there, it was a little downtime, and we said, let's go to the Computer Museum. Sounds interesting, in San Jose, California. Boy, how much closer to Silicon Valley could you be? You're in the middle of it. So I went to this museum, and it's an amazing museum. And of course, it starts out, it's one of those museums where you kind of, it's going to follow this circuitous path through the museum, and you come out the other end. But, it starts out with some very antique, ancient equipment from the 1600s where, like, I don't know, it was Newton or, people of the 1600s and 1700s were coming up with mechanical devices that would calculate. If you clicked on a ring with some numbers on it, then another arrow would point somewhere, and lo and behold, it was an early adding machine, basically. And it was very interesting because it was invented at a time long before electricity and long before technology. But yet, even then in the 1600s, people were thinking about this idea. Can we mechanize counting? Can we mechanize mathematics? And of course, this museum started out with these couple of early attempts at computing, which were mechanical, fascinating to see. And then, of course, marches through time. And you start to see the early iterations of computers during World War II, and they're a room full of, machines and tubes and, that was that gray metal that was kind of dimple sprayed with like gray military paint. And then, of course, you go through and you get into the 1960s and then the 1970s and then the beginning of the 1980s when personal computing started to happen with the advent. Well, actually, I suppose one could point a finger at IBM and Bill Gates and that whole story. But then it moves through, of course, talking about how coding works, and then you get to the other end, and that's the modern stuff. So I'm walking through this museum, of course, just fascinated. And every station I stopped at, I was going, I bought one of those. Oh, I have one of those. Oh, I have one of those in my basement. Oh, there's another. I had that. It was the only museum I've ever been in my life where I was older than the artifacts in the museum. And that really stuck in my mind. I said, man, I'm older than the artifacts in this museum. It just made me feel really good. But I've been blessed, with a relatively long life. And but the point is, there's a whole museum full of stuff that's obsolete. Like, if you look at the Palm Pilot. As a matter of fact, I do believe in my desk drawer, I have my Palm Pilot. I can't find the charger, but there it is. So the point is, the technology, as we all know, has moved. And if you've purchased computers, I'm staring at the screen of my computer that's from a wonderful large computer company named after a piece of fruit. But the obsolete versions are sitting on the shelf just over there because they don't run the software of today. And you think, boy, that was kind of a lot of money I spent on those beautiful machines that are sitting there. But the operating software can't be updated because the chips are different inside. So there sits thousands of dollars of equipment on a shelf gathering dust. And of course, I'm talking on a new piece of equipment that I'm sure will be obsolete in the next 3 or 4 years. But the point is, technology moves rather quickly. And that's why the big debate is that you're building these, 16, 1,800 acres of land and these buildings, and you stuff them full of state-of-the-art electronics, which are servers, which take electricity and then they crunch data. And of course, the data output is exported. That's the product. Somebody's paying for that data. But somebody's also paying for the electricity to run the machines that crunch the numbers that create the data. So it's an interesting business model. And effectively, it's also a derivative model, because if you go to the front door of the data center, you're not, you can't buy a bushel basket full of data. This is something they're using, that these big companies that are building them are using as a tool to crunch the data they need so that they can put it into an output format that has value in the marketplace. And, who knows what they're going to do with the data, other than the fact that this is a great big tool that they're building, and it's sitting on a great big piece of land, and it takes, an ocean of water to cool this thing, and it takes an amazing amount of electricity to run this thing so that they can crunch whatever they're crunching in there and produce whatever output they're producing in there so that they can sell it into the course of commerce, the chain of commerce. That's the whole thing. It's no different than if you had a bakery. If you were in the business of selling bread, you'd have to have a bakery, and it'd have to have some ovens and prep table and some storage for the flour and this and that. You'd have equipment, capital. That's what capital is. So you take your inputs, and then you make your goods to be sold, or your service to be sold, goods, services, and then you sell it. And there has to be enough margin to cover the cost of that capital. This is like billions of dollars of capital sitting there. So whoever's crunching these numbers, then using this data, is getting a lot of revenue for it, and the revenue has to support the plant, and it has to support that 1,600 acres of land, and I don't know, 6 or 8 buildings, and whatever else is going on in there. And somebody has to mow the lawn, and I'm sure there's probably a night watch person and maybe a janitor or two to empty there aren't even any waste baskets because nobody's working there. But the point is, it's an economic decision. It's a capital allocation, no different than building an automobile plant, or perhaps any other factory, or a hospital. There's always revenue that will support the expenditure of capital to develop that gigantic thing. The revenue has to be there to support it. And if the revenue fails, well, then lo and behold, you have a bunch of money tied up in capital that just goes to waste. And, at least in the Midwest, and, at least across the northern part of the country, you can drive from Chicago to New York, and you can see nothing but, empty factory buildings that used to be, capital. Somebody paid for the building, and there was machines in there, and labor came along, and inputs came in, and they made stuff, they sold stuff. And at some point, that facility stopped being economic. It wasn't profitable for the company to run that facility. So they lay everybody off and shut the factory, and then the thing deteriorates, looks like a ghost town. They're all over the place. Well, that's what we're observing in the data world. So the bigger question is, okay, that's fine, but when we talk about electric generation, and I want to go back to this issue because it's so very important. People today, generalizing, I never like doing that, but today we don't think about electricity as anything other than a given. If you have a desk lamp, you plug the little cord into the wall socket, turn the desk lamp on, and poof, it works. Or here, my computer screen, it's plugged into the wall. If you turn it on, and here I am, it works. We don't think about what is behind that curtain. And I think this is something we need to be really thinking about as we debate this issue of massive capital expenditure when we're putting up gigantic factories that don't hire people. Back in the olden days, the thing that really, tripped Karl Marx's switch was that capital would build a building and fill it full of machines, and then you bring in labor and exploit the labor. You get them to work as cheaply as possible for as long as possible. No safety protections. Labor's, is an expendable commodity. Somebody gets hurt, you fire them, you bring in the next one. Read Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. It's the same thing. That was what triggered the whole idea in Karl Marx's head that there's labor and there's capital. Well, from the capital perspective, we are building these massive capital expenditure plans. There are billions and billions of dollars in capital, but there's no labor. Now, what would old Carl have to say about that? The capitalists say, okay, Carl, you've been worried about labor for 200 years. Guess what? We're not doing labor. And then, it could be robots. That was always the big fear in Detroit and other places, that robots would supplant humans, and then robots don't buy cars, only humans, and they're all unemployed, so they can't afford cars. But we've taken this to a steroid-based, driven level with respect to massive capital investment with no labor. So let's think about that from the perspective of structure. How do you do that? I unfortunately have to take a break here, but when I come back, I want to close this loop, and we want to talk about what's behind that curtain. So I'll be right back. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now, and we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
Okay, I'm back. So before I'm going to dive into what's behind the curtain on the energy side of these data centers, but I want to point out why this is relevant. And of course, every day, every show, if you subscribe to the Vault and you go back to coming up on 3 years of broadcasting, every day I mention $38.5 trillion in federal debt from the Congress overspent its revenues because they spend more than they collect from taxes and tariffs, and our $2.5 trillion in annual deficit. And why is this important? How does it factor into data centers? Well, because it does. It's just all part of the economy that we operate in. And I wanted to point out that Congress is coming up with a clever bipartisan plan where they're going to cap the deficit, that it can't be any more than 3% of the federal spend. When you cap the deficit at 3%, it doesn't matter. The deficit is still 2.5 trillion, and they're going to cap it, and they're capping it, which tells you that they will have deficits as far as the eye can see forever. And they will also have an increase in national debt until they raise the debt ceiling, which they will. They're not going to stop. So the point is, when you're seeing this news story about we're going to cap this at 3%, we want to look responsible in a midterm election year. Yeah, right. The point is that you should be watching this story with somewhat of a jaundiced eye, because at the end of the day, what they're saying is we're going to bake in a 3% increase into the massive deficit, which will fuel the massive debt. It's hocus pocus, but they're trying to look responsible in a midterm election year. Okay, so back to data centers. I want to get back to the subject. Here's the thing with electricity. In order to run these data centers, assuming the technology of the day, and I talked about this yesterday, this is state-of-the-art server technology. It's the best there is. Okay, this is not quantitative or quantum computing. This is good old-fashioned bits and bytes, data on and off, binary system, and state-of-the-art stuff. And we're going to build all these buildings. We're going to pack it full of machines. We're going to plug it into the wall. They're all going to run with a lot of electricity, because you have to have a lot of electricity to turn off all these zillions of micro switches that are going on and off, on and off, on and off. That's what a binary system is. It's either on or it's off. When you get a zillion of them doing this, that's how you calculate and you create data. So this machine is basically, you can imagine an infinite number of little switches all wiggling when you turn it on. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie from the 1950s. Well, that's what this thing does all day long. And of course, to get these switches to move, that's mechanical. It's electromechanical energy. So the electricity coming in, of course, as the switches are all going like this, produce heat. And of course, we talked about this yesterday. You bring water in, but you can't bring dirty Lake Michigan water in because there's like fish in it, and there's seaweed, and I won't even go into the Milwaukee Sewage District issue we got here, but the point is water has to be cleaned, and in order to clean the water sufficiently so you can run it through the evaporation cooling system, you got to use electricity to clean the water. And of course, when you clean the water, all the stuff that you've cleaned out of it becomes sediment, and it's concentrated. There's all sorts of heavy metals, mercury from the coal plants, the whole package. It becomes an environmental thing of itself. So it's a very complicated machine. Not only do you have to you build a building, you stuff it full of machines that go like this, you have to have the electricity coming in, and it takes a lot of electricity, and then you have to cool it, okay? That's just to get your machine working so you can make this data that you can sell to somebody else. That's the business model. Well, the water is an issue we can talk about. Maybe I'll talk about that tomorrow, because that's a whole issue unto itself. But today is Electricity Day. And of course, I mentioned this yesterday. If you watch the program, what you realize is between the plant they're building in Port Washington, Wisconsin, which is a very, very large plant, and Microsoft is building 15 of these units down in the old Foxconn failure that is in Racine County, where they built, they promised us the sun and the moon and the stars, and you have a zillion jobs, and everybody's going to make TV screens or something. Well, that never happened, but you have this gigantic campus that was rather well subsidized. So now Microsoft is building data centers down there and up here. And when you add the data center, the load demand for electricity, it is more than all of the homes in Wisconsin. Two plants, well, two facilities, two sites, is more electricity than all the homes of Wisconsin. Now, that's an interesting number, and people say, "Wow, that's a big number," but you have to stop. And this is where the Eastman Financial Report gets into the critical thinking stuff. They kind of peel back the onion, and you let the silver minnow flights by. We don't go for the minnow. We ask the bigger question: what is that filament line attached to the nose of the silver minnow, and what is that all about? That's what we want to know. Well, here's the thing. When you regulate electricity, and keep in mind, I spent 3 years on the Wisconsin Public Service Commission as one of the 3 members, and it was my job with my 2 colleagues to vote on these things. Rate cases, the utilities would come in and say, we need more money, we got to jack up the rates. And our role was very, very well defined, because when electricity was invented back in the early 1900s, Edison and Nikolai Tesla, the very famous name and a very brilliant mind, were effectively creating what was becoming the electrification of America. And it was a very important thing. And of course, in the big cities, when there was a market, if you put up a generator and you could run wires across the street to your neighbors, and people would pay you for electricity. They wouldn't need kerosene lamps or candles or oil lamps. You could flip a switch and your home would be illuminated, or your business. It was a big deal. Well, lo and behold, Edison's business was selling Edison generators from sea to shining sea. Every small town, you had dealers, distributors. You'd buy an Edison generator, you'd fire it up, and you'd sell electricity to anybody nearby, and you'd run a wire. Well, before you know it, there's wires all over town. I mean, you had 15 guys in town. They're all selling electricity. Wires are crossing the streets everywhere. Somebody got the idea that said, it would be better for us as a municipality to have one electric company running its wires in a logical place, in a logical time and pattern, rather than 15 people running wires all over the place. This is, not only is it dangerous when you're talking 110, 120 volts or 220, if a wire comes down or somebody touches it, the fire truck goes by with the ladder up. This is a danger. So what emerged was a model of, let's regulate these electricity companies and bring some logic to this. And of course, Edison wasn't happy, and Tesla's laughing because there was a big duke-em up between the two. But what emerged was the cities would grant a monopoly to one company. Now, monopolies, if you remember the trust-busting days of Teddy Roosevelt, monopolies were a bad word. They're still a bad word, because if you have a monopoly on a market, you can charge whatever you want, and you make excess monopoly profits. We teach this in Economics 102, and they're bad. So what we do is we regulated the monopoly, electricity companies, and said, you have an obligation to serve all the customers in your territory. territory. We're going to carve out a territory, and this is your monopoly. You have an obligation to serve, but we're going to set your electric rates so you don't rip off the populace. And the way this works, very simplified, is that the utility regulators will look at the capital base of installed assets, generation, transmission, distribution, those are the three components. And we'll say, okay, you got $1 zillion invested in that. We're going to give you a 10.5% return or whatever the number they decide on. And you're going to make 10.5% on your money, and you have an obligation to serve, which means you got to keep the lights on. Okay. And that was the deal. And this was in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s. Well, the 1930s, the cities were illuminating quite rapidly and quite nicely. And people who lived in the cities and the villages either had a monopoly shareholder-owned utility where the shareholders are making 10.5% on their money, or the municipalities would get into their own business, buy the generators, and they would offer it at cost to their citizens. So municipal power came around to sort of keep the Wall Street profits out. So if you lived in a municipal electric utility, your rates were cheaper than those Wall Street guys because they had to charge extra for the dividends, pay the shareholders, which is capitalism. It worked, and it still works. It's still the model. Well, then the third problem came is that the people in the rural areas, they didn't have electricity. And they're still burning kerosene, and it was really a poverty issue. So during the 1930s, the Rural Electrification Program, REA administration came, and they electrified rural America. They'd run, the federal government effectively financed this, and they financed it through a cooperative model, which the socialists loved. Man, there's no shareholders, it's collectivism. But the co-ops have been very, very effective in delivering electricity because what they do is they buy from the generating and transmission people, and sometimes they even own generation, and then they distribute it to their co-op members, again, within a region. And they had an obligation to serve, but any profits made are given back to the members as basically a dividend or a refund on the annual. If they make a profit, the profit's distributed amongst the members. If the municipals make a profit, they lower the rates so people don't pay too much. And if the corporation, the big investor-owned utilities, make a profit, they distribute it to their shareholders. That's the model. And it's been the model since regulation started. So as part of that, you don't want the utilities building massive generation that nobody needs because they're earning 10.5% on assets that aren't utilized and they're not needed to keep the system robust and stable. So it's just excess profits. That's why they say a utility it makes money if you use golden doorknobs on their headquarters, because whenever they invest money into capital, they get 10.5%. It's like almost a guarantee. That's why there's a very lucrative businesses, and that's why people who invest in utility stocks tend to do rather well over time. The point is, all of this is regulated depending upon how much load is there in your service territory, and we want you to meet that load, and we want you to have spinning reserves and reserve generating capacity in case a substation goes down or a storm comes through or something happens. You need enough excess generation so that the lights don't go out. And you as a regulator, this is built into the formula. And you say, okay, we'd like to see about 20%, and then, the shareholder or the customers will say, no, we want 15% until the lights go out. Then they wonder why the lights go out. But the point is, there's a balance, and there's a number picked, and that's your reserve. So you have 100% of the load plus 20%. Let's just say 20%. Well, if you put these two plants online, you're going to have to double the amount of generating capacity in the state of Wisconsin. And anybody like me who's been through the process of trying to permit a generating station, that is a long process. Nobody wants it in their backyard. The environmental community doesn't want the emissions. They don't want the water contamination. Nobody wants the noise. Nobody wants this. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants these things. So when you site a generating facility, it takes 5-10 years to build one of these things out, and then you have to beef up the transmission line so you can get the power from the generator to the distribution. That takes time, 5 to 10 years. So what we're doing is you're doubling the demand load for electricity the generating capacity is not there today. And in order to get to it, it's going to take 5 or 10 years of arguing to try and get more generation. And if in that time, that building full of machines that are going like this and doing data, if that becomes obsolete, because like I said in the museum, the technology moves rather quickly, you've got a massive problem with an empty factory where the machines are not taking electricity, but you have doubled the size of generating capacity when half of it was 2 plants that may have failed or may go out of business or may be shut down within 5 years. And those the costs of those utilities will stay on people's rates for decades, for generations, because you can't just undo a power plant. Because once you build it, the ratepayers are committed to pay for that power plant forever. And that's why this has not been looked at very carefully. And the big problem that these developers have is that software technology, like Fractal technology and other big players, are looking at ways of processing data a lot more efficiently using a lot less electricity. And that's a business risk that exists. But the residual impact to society is stranded electric costs. You may have electrical generation forever that you'll never ever use, and you, instead of 20% reserve, you may have like 110% reserve, which is phenomenal. It's something very interesting. And I think the regulators are going to have to take a very close look at this. It's good to have technology, and of course we all need AI and lots of data, but we better ask the question, who picks up the tab? And I can assure you, it's you. Okay, have a great afternoon. I'll be back tomorrow. Maybe we'll talk about the water issue. But thanks so much, and be sure to make a donation at Worldview Foundation. Have a blessed afternoon. Bye.